You're listening to Switched On Australia, the podcast that tracks the opportunities and challenges of the renewable energy transition and electrifying everything, everywhere. Switched On is proudly brought to you by Boundless Earth. Boundless Earth uses philanthropy, investment and direct advocacy to help Australia become a global force in a decarbonised world. Switched On is also brought to you by GoodWe, the all-in-one ESA battery system safely powering Aussie homes, lowering bills and providing energy independence. Hello and welcome to Switched On Australia. I'm Adelaide. Thanks for joining me. Last week at the Energy Networks conference in Adelaide, the head of the Peak Networks agency made a bit of a pitch for the future of the grid. He said households should start treating energy like their fruit and veg. Grow your own if you can, buy local if you can't. It's a view of our electricity system driven by rooftop solar, home batteries and electric vehicles, what we call consumer energy resources. These are the technologies that are providing some of the cheapest electricity in the country. And whilst many of us know this, it's interesting that someone representing the poles and wires companies should be advocating it. Because Australia's electricity networks weren't set up to deal directly with consumers. They're actually supposed to stay out of the competitive market and have nothing to do with what happens behind the meter. Their job is just to connect homes to the grid. But some networks are pushing to change that. They reckon they should be the ones to manage consumer energy resources. And if they have more flexibility, more data, they can avoid overbuilding the grid as we fully electrify and try to keep costs down. But that's contentious. There are plenty of people who are warning that giving networks more control risks entrenching their monopoly power and stifling the innovation of retailers. The Australian Energy Market Commission is currently reviewing network rules to better integrate consumer energy resources into the system that was never designed for two-way power flows. To do that, though, we really need detailed information on how, why and when consumers use electricity and how that's changing. Which is why Visnet recently surveyed more than 8,000 consumers across Australia, the UK and New Zealand about their electricity use. One of the authors of that report is Mark Sprawson, the Chief Commercial Officer at EA Technology. This is a global organisation based in the UK that advises networks. Mark Sprawson, thanks so much for joining the Switched On podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me, Anne. Great to be here.
Now, Mark, you guys have recently done a report that's focused very much on what electricity networks need to fully embrace during this energy transition. But electricity networks, certainly here in Australia, have traditionally been quite separate from the customer. They build and maintain the poles and wires, but they don't really engage with what's happening inside the home. Why is it now so important for them to understand consumer behaviour?
So I think the reason that it's so important at this critical juncture as we move towards a net zero future, Anne, is because if you think about what networks were built for and how they were constructed, and I'm sure you've had many guests on in the past talking about the whole top-down kind of ethos that existed. They were built there to kind of serve from big generation all the way through to the end consumer. Nowadays, of course, we're much more familiar with the idea that the last kilometre of the network has become the first kilometre of the network, and there's a view that maybe we're actually looking at the system the wrong way up. So it's really important that networks need to engage much more at that what's been traditionally regarded as the bottom end of the network, where all those customers connect. Because if you think about it, that's where all the change is happening. You know, the edge of that grid is the centre of the change. The change is driven by customers going out and making choices around what they're purchasing, whether that's rooftop solar, behind-the-meter batteries, electric vehicles, and so on. So networks have to be cognizant of that and have to be able to make sure that they are offering services to the customer that actually meets their needs in that changing landscape. So that's why we've commissioned this report now, because that change that's happening right down at the low voltage end of the grid, where all those customers are connected, is absolutely critical to the success of the energy transition.
So, from your perspective, how fundamentally does that change the role of the electricity network in terms of what they can and should be doing?
Yeah, it is a real fundamental change. And we're seeing this not just in Australia, but globally, right? I mean, again, historically, what did consumers care about and want from their network provider, their network operator? They wanted to know that when they flick that switch on the wall, that the lights come on, and they want to hopefully pay as little as is reasonable for that service. But going forward, when you've invested, your hard-earned dollars in that rooftop solar system and that battery, you want to make sure that you can leverage the benefits of that. And you
Mm.
don't want to live in a world where that might be curtailed or constrained in some way because of some kind of limitation that there is on the local network. You also are increasingly dependent on electricity moving forward, particularly as we start to electrify transport, which, although it's had a slow kind of uptake initially in Australia, there are forecasts that suggest that's going to increase quite significantly, and we're seeing that elsewhere. So as electricity becomes the default medium for not just for kind of how you heat or cool your home, how you perform your cooking and your entertainment and everything else, but also how you get from A to B and all that critical infrastructure, it takes on a different kind of paradigm. And electricity almost becomes kind of the driving force of the economy of the future and how we live our lives. So that relationship that the customer has with the network provider changes and it becomes much more of a kind of contract that works two ways, right? In terms of what they can get from the system to enable their needs as well.
I'm just wondering, as you say, that relationship is fundamentally changing, but the rules say that they're not supposed to engage directly with customers or even those competitive technologies like batteries, home batteries. Is that separation now, do you think, becoming a barrier to the energy transition?
That's a really interesting question, and there's very good reasons why that kind of unbundling and separation has happened. And again, it's common across the world. It's not just an Australian issue. I don't think it's necessarily a barrier, but in the sense that we should be looking to reverse that trend in any way. However, what it is a clear driver and a clear signal that the network operators have to engage with people across that whole kind of ecosystem and value chain with the customer. So what I mean by that is that, if you're a customer who's invested in solar storage, an electric vehicle, you need to make sure that you can get the most out of those assets. And the way in which you can do that is by having probably a good relationship with your energy retailer who enables you to do that. If your energy retailer is enabling you to, I don't know, discharge your vehicle back into the grid to sell your solar export spill out into the grid and so on and so forth, that all requires the electricity network operator to clearly serve those needs in terms of having a network that can facilitate that and can accept those things coming onto the grid. So there's much more of a need for the sort of network system providers to be able to work with retailers, with other aggregators and actors within the system to ensure that fundamentally what the customer wants can be met by the holistic sum of all of those different actors within that value chain. So I don't think it's about the network provider having more of a relationship directly with the customer, but it's about them and engaging in that wider ecosystem.
Engaging in that wider ecosystem, but also potentially orchestrating what they call orchestrating the consumer energy resources. Do you believe that networks are best placed to be doing that sort of thing?
I think we have to respect the fact that network operators are incredibly good at what they do. They understand the systems, the networks better than anyone else, and we have to ensure that they continue to be the custodians of that, right? Because again, in the world we're moving to increasingly, where it's a multi-directional flow, no one understands better than the network operators the needs, the challenges, the intricacies of trying to manage those local networks. But in order for them to do that, they really need to ensure that they've got the visibility in real time, really, of what's going on those networks, so that they can, in fact, serve the needs of all those different players who we've just been talking about. And that's been one of the issues, I think, historically that they've had, which is, right up at the higher voltage end of their networks, they've always had really strong signals of exactly what's happening in real time. And again, when the system was built down at the low voltage end where the customers connect, it was kind of on a fit and forget type basis, where it
Mm.
was, that will just work, it's fine, it'll serve the needs of that consumer. Nowadays, of course, with those multi-directional flows, with those different use cases that the consumers are looking to engage within, there's much more of a need to have that visibility to act and to dynamically change and respond and facilitate those needs. And that's something where the network system operators are kind of coming to that realization, but they're still on a journey there.
Yes. And as you said, I mean, that's overall called grid edge intelligence, isn't it? And I know your report talks about the need for that grid edge intelligence. It's apparent when you think about it that, that point at which the home meets the network, isn't it, I suppose?
Yeah.
But just essentially getting better visibility into what's happening in homes. And it can make the system more efficient, but it also means more monitoring of household behaviour and more responsibility on consumers, doesn't it? On customers, if you like, as I understand that they're now being referred to in the UK. Where do you see the limits, though, of that approach?
So that's a great question, and there's always a challenge of, do you need more monitoring, right?
Mm.
Because in certain parts of Australia, so you look at Victoria, for example, where there's essentially 100% smart meter coverage, people might say, well, why on earth do you need more monitoring? You already got full smart meter penetration. Surely that gives you everything you need to know. And of course, that's a really good point. But it's about what you're using that data to inform and what kind of action you are trying to drive from that data. So having smart meter data that tells you what's happening, once every 5 or 10 minutes within that home can be useful. But if you're really trying to drive operational performance within the network to make sure that you are maximizing at every point throughout the day how much solar can export onto the grid, how much kind of vehicle to grid discharge there could be to enable real value creation for Australians up and down the country, you need to have monitoring and intelligence that actually is much more granular, that allows networks to flex and to move around in terms of how they're operating. And that's really what we're seeing in some other parts of the world right now, including in the UK, where there's been a real drive to not just monitor, but to really install devices that can impose that intelligence onto the system and drive those actionable outcomes. And a lot of that comes from regulatory drive as well as just from network need, right? To really say, the regulators sort of insisting we need to ensure value for customers can be created. And this is an absolutely key enabler to creating that value.
You call it intelligence, but tin tax, is that intelligence another third party? Is it another company that collects the data and reports on the data, which then goes back to networks? Just give me something tin tax that, a consumer will understand by intelligence.
Sure. So the way it's working in Europe right now is you will have technology providers who will provide network operators with monitoring kit, right, that can be installed at a transformer level in a substation somewhere, a substation that maybe feeds anything from 50 to 250 customers, that kind of order. What they will then do is actually collect data at a really, really high frequency at that site. So not just your smart meter data, one monitor every few minutes. And then what they do is they act on that data, they curate it, they process it, they parse it, whatever terminology you want to use. And then instead of just shipping data back to the network operator, what they ship is insights. Because if you
Mm.
just ship data in and of itself is meaningless. If I can give you a quick example of that, in the UK right now, Visnet, who commissioned this report from EA Technology, collects more data samples every second than there are human beings on the planet.
Good
But
grief.
but how on earth do you process that? How do you make sense of all of that data? So that's where the really clever kind of AI and kind of machine learning algorithms that have been developed over the past 5 years come in and turn that data into a meaningful insight. And it's those insights that are passed to the network operator, not the data itself. They can still see the data if they want, but like I say, it's like wading through soup, right? You need to kind of have those insights to drive it. So what they get instead is a curated list of, here is the top 100 things you should do on your network right now to improve performance, to improve customer outcomes, to ensure everyone can benefit from say the kind of technology that they have invested in. So I can go into some more detail on some of those examples, maybe if that's helpful, Anne.
Which countries in particular are moving in that, have already moved in that direction?
So certainly the UK, where I am based, has moved very strongly in that direction, say driven by a regulatory ethos initially, but all across Europe. So all across Europe, you're seeing these type of systems being installed, and that's Western Europe, Central Europe, the Nordics. We're also starting to see it now across Asia Pacific, and even down into the likes of New Zealand as well, where the first tentative steps into some of this are being taken. Australia is becoming alert and alive to this, and we see it as a matter of time before the same thing happens here.
And so, do you envisage that these collection points will be on all houses, or all houses with consumer energy resources?
So the collection point itself is actually just at the substation, at the infrastructure that's owned by
Right.
the network operator. So it's not intrusive in any way to the customer. And it's worth saying as well that all of the data is completely anonymous because it's essentially aggregated up. So if you think about the way in which a network architecture would form, you have one of these transformers or substations, which might be up a pole or might be in a kiosk. From that, there's maybe anywhere between 1 and 5 circuits that flow out. And on each of those circuits, you might have anywhere between, say, 5 and 50 customers connected. So it measures the sum, the aggregate of what's going on for those 50 customers, and then makes decisions
Hmm.
to help those customers as a collective, right? So it's not about trying to spy on exactly what's going on with your home at any given point. It's all about looking at the collective and making sure that the overall system supports what's going on there.
Let's drill down a little bit into the report that you've done on consumer behaviour. We often talk about a future surge in demand for electricity, with more and more of us electrifying our homes. But your report seems to suggest that we might almost already be there. You found that 70% of consumers already have medium or high electricity use. Does that mean that the demand challenge is already here?
So there is, of course, a challenge right now with keeping pace with what's going on purely just in today's terms. It doesn't mean that it's not going to continue accelerating though. So the report actually also found that domestic demand is predicted in Australia to increase by some 35% over the next 5 years, driven primarily by things like electrification of transport, by more air conditioning usage as well, using air conditioning type units for air purification as well going forward. So there's lots of different kind of technologies and use cases that will continue to drive that up. What that means is that the challenge is actually are not necessarily around just the capacity that exists within the network, but just about how that network operates. If you think about
Mm.
a really simple system where everyone's got solar on their roof, what that actually does is it starts to drive up the voltage during the middle of the day when all that solar is generating. And then in the evening, if everyone has an electric vehicle, what happens is the demand drastically increases and then the voltage gets dragged down. And you might think, well, why is that an issue? And the reason it's an issue is just because that voltage swing is actually one of the harder things sometimes for a network operator to be able to manage. And this is where things like the grid edge intelligence really help, because it can understand and predict what's happening with that voltage and can then actually recommend actions that can help maintain a constant voltage, meaning that all customers can get access to export and import whenever they need it without having to worry about constraints, curtailments, or anything like that.
And I understand that it's like I think you called it a stacking effect when you combine the impact. If we all have an EV, we all put in our heat pumps, we get some extra air conditioning, and we've got home batteries.
Yep.
It's sort of like where, multiple technologies are landing in the home at almost at once, and driving up a sharp jump in demand.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and as I said, it's the criticality of those appliances as well for how we live our lives, right? But that's
Mm.
where energy networks and the wider ecosystem really need to think about how do they serve, what I prefer to think of as the customer rather than the consumer. So I think it really puts at the heart that this is a person or a group of people living within a house at the end of this line. It's
And
not
they're
just
being
someone who's
provided a service.
they're being provided a service. We need to think of energy much more as a service rather than a simple kind of product if you like. It's a service that they're needing. And one of the ways in which we can really help with that is if we look at examples from around the world, right? If energy use is going to increase because of electrification of transport, people are going to have their electric vehicles they want to charge overnight. How do you make it such that it's really economically efficient for them to do that and easy? Because one of the things the report found was that something like 2/3 of respondents within Australia felt that they could actually shift around some of their peak demand, right? And what we're seeing in other territories like the UK right now is where retailers are actually offering to charge vehicles for customers at the lowest cost. By which what we mean is that you get home from work and you plug your vehicle in and you just have an app that says, I need my vehicle to be charged by 7 a.m., 6 a.m., whatever it might be, right? When you're
We
next
have
going
a
to use the
couple of
vehicle.
retailers offering the special rates for EV charging overnight.
Yeah, so there's the special rates which kind of reduces it, and then there's also the dynamic kind of cut in and cut out as well, which basically means that it's not just so you have some simple ones which are rates which is cheaper from 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. or whatever it might be, and you have others where actually they can match the local supply and demand according to what's going on with market forces and with the wholesale energy market to
Which
basically
comes back
say
to that granular intelligence again.
Exactly. And this is why having that intelligence of what's going on and where these customers are and when they need it, all of that kind of stacks up and becomes part of the holistic solution, right?
So what you're saying is that so much of it as we move forward is about the networks understanding not only the capacity of the network, but the capacity of human beings to change their behaviour. That is an interesting statistic that you mentioned, that 2/3 of people think that they could shift usage to
Yeah.
off-peak times. So is that an untapped resource sitting there in our households?
Well, potentially, yeah, and this is why when people say, "Oh, energy demand is going to increase by so much, this is going to cause problems for networks. Things are going to overload because everyone will charge their electric vehicle at the same time." This is where we really need to temper that with, yeah, but there's ways in which the problem in inverted commas can also become the solution, right? Because if the problem is everyone on one street buys an electric vehicle, and the solution is actually all those electric vehicles could be staggered in when they're charging so they don't cause any local network impact, and it actually helps offset and balance up the kind of load over a 24-hour period. That's actually a good thing for a network provider. And
Are
what
you
we've found,
confident that people can do that in a coordinated way?
so we've seen it work, and so I was part of the largest, certainly the largest European trial of managed electric vehicle charging a number of years ago. It was called Electric Nation in the UK, where we had over 750 participants involved in just this type of scheme, and it showed that actually they realized economic value from participating, and the network realized benefits in terms of how it was operated. So it's kind of like a symbiotic relationship. It works for everybody. It definitely can work. You just need to make it simple for the customer. That's the key learning there. No one, not even an energy geek like myself, is going to sit there and program something to charge for 30 minutes, then cut off because the price is higher, and then cut back in again. You need to just basically have a one button type system, right? It's like, charge my car by 6 a.m., make it as cheap as you can, please. That's all you need.
Exactly, because those 2/3 of consumers who say that they could shift usage to off-peak times, saying that you can is one thing, actually doing is another. And like you say, if it's not simple, if it's not easy, 2/3 of those consumers are not going to do it, are they?
Precisely. It's all about that customer experience, and that customer experience has to be seamless, has to be painless, and has to be something that they don't have to engage with on a every day or every week. It's kind of just set me up, help me out, and then run with it, right? But
Yeah.
we've seen it work, and we've seen that doing this and having this kind of level of grid edge intelligence to manage these things in the UK is driving something like a 22% increase in available capacity just
Oh,
through being
wow.
able to do this. So if you think about what that means in real terms, that can mean kind of an extra 5 rooftop solar installs, 5 behind the meter battery storage systems being connected without any constraints or any need for network upgrades. So it's real tangible outcomes for the average customer.
I was just wondering, the people that you surveyed, those 2/3 of consumers who think they can shift usage to off-peak times, do we know who they are? Because I wonder, Are they homeowners rather than renters? Do they live in houses rather than apartments? Clearly, the energy transition, it's much harder for renters and people who live in apartments. It certainly is here in Australia. And it affects their ability to shift their time of use. So I was just wondering, can you tell me who these people are?
Yeah, for sure. It is a good point you make because just at the conference I was at this week, talking around sort of electrification of transport and the challenges that it introduces. That split between the homeowner and the person who has kind of off-street parking to charge their EV versus having to charge it somewhere more remotely. All of these things are very real, right? But what we found was it was fairly uniform in the sense that everyone felt that they could shift some. And obviously, it's those who own their own
Mm.
homes, and there were certain generational differences as well. It was actually the kind of younger Australians who said they felt they could shift more than some of the older generation. But even then, I think in 18 to 24-year-olds, it was something like 80%. But then in homeowners in the kind of 30 to 40 bracket, it was still about 75% as you went through with it, say, averages out to around about 66, 67% overall. So there are variations there that exist. Of course there are. But the good news is that a lot of those variations also exist at this kind of low voltage circuit level, right? So you tend to get a bit of a mix sometimes of those different customers that actually exist within the same circuit, so that you don't tend to get necessarily these pinch points arising where there is no opportunity to do this. There's usually a blend of customers who exist in these different locations.
Yes. It is interesting, isn't it, when you start to break it down? You've got younger people who are probably more flexible, a bit more tech savvy, for instance, and then you've got older people who might have a bit more money. You've got your homeowners, you've got your renters. How should networks and energy companies respond to those differences? What should they do with those insights?
So what they need to do is think about how they're serving the needs of all of their customers, right? And again, it's a wider ecosystem issue. There are always going to be some, the more engaged, the more tech savvy, who are going to be early adopters of this kind of approach. And we need to be realistic with ourselves that no kind of initiative you have, no journey you want to go on towards decarbonisation is going to have 100% backing from the entire population. It's just not
Mm.
conceivable. But what you have to do is make sure that no one gets left behind. So you have to make sure that what you're doing in terms of if you are benefiting certain areas of the population, certain demographics, that's not at the expense of some other portion of the demographic. So we have a thing in the UK which says we can't leave anyone behind in the energy transition. It has to be a fair and a just transition for all. So anything that is being thought about is thought about obviously in terms of the benefits that it creates for those who will participate, but also it has to consider, are there any disbenefits that will be inflicted on others? Because if there are, we don't want to do it. We want to make sure that it's only a kind of a net positive, yeah? Nothing that's going to actually be a kind of a zero-sum game where someone wins because someone else loses, because
Mm.
that's not the way in which we're going to be successful.
But it also means, and again, I suppose it just underlines the reason why you've done this report, really drilling down into those different behaviours. Maybe it's the retailers. The retailers have to step up a little bit in terms of really targeting different demographics, different segments of the population.
I think so. At the end of the day, it is the retailer who has that relationship with the customer and is engaging with them rather than the kind of the network provider, as you mentioned earlier. So it comes back to this whole point around, networks can no longer be thought of in isolation. It's an energy system,
Mm.
not just an energy network. And that's where we need to really think of this in terms of a systems level thinking type approach if we're going to be successful. But one of the other ways in which I think you can bring people along in that journey is, we mentioned about grid edge intelligence. We've talked a lot about how it can manage capacity on the network and alleviate any constraints that might exist. The great thing about grid edge intelligence is that it actually has a whole range of different value stacking options with it. Once you have it there, you can use it for all different insights. And one thing that will really help bring people along is if I think they can see real benefits in the way in which their energy is provided and served to them through things like increased reliability. Everyone wants, to be able to know the lights are going to come on when they flip the switch and hopefully not go out unexpectedly. what we're seeing now increasingly in the UK is using this grid edge intelligence to actually predict where faults will happen on the network before they actually happen. So if you can do that, you can actually ensure that you take remedial action as a network provider and avoid customers being interrupted. And again, as we go forward in the energy transition and electricity becomes such an important and integral part of all of our lives for everything, knowing that you're increasing that reliability has serious economic value, right, to everybody in how they go about their lives.
Okay, we'll take a short break and be back straight after this short message from one of our sponsors.
G'day, Alex Carey here. The Goodwe ESA all-in-one home storage solution is here, and it's a game changer. It's packed with market-leading features, full home backup and 6-level battery protection. With up to 48 kilowatt hours in a single stack, the ESA is a breeze to install with no gateway needed. The Goodwe ESA series is available now and priced to cover the 2026 drop in the rebate. Visit goodwe.com.au for more information.
My guest today on Switched On is Mark Sprawson, the Chief Commercial Officer at EA Technology. And we're talking about the changing role of electricity networks in a world increasingly impacted by consumer energy resources. And in particular, a report that Mark helped write, which looks at how, when and why consumers use electricity in the UK, New Zealand and Australia. Now, we've touched on this a little bit. The report says that nearly half of the consumers that you talk to say they're planning to buy an EV or an electric bike in the next 5 years. And that clearly has implications for the grid. But you also found EV charging, for those who are lucky enough to have one, is often happening overnight. Does that suggest consumers are already willing, able to reduce pressure on the grid, or are they driven primarily by financial reasons for doing it? They get a good rate.
So I think I'd be lying if I said that, electricity customers are thinking, how can I improve the life of my local network provider, right? Everyone is driven by what's going to cost me the least and inconvenience me the least and service my needs, right? And overnight charging works for a lot of people for that reason. And we see, I think, globally, it's something like 80% of electric vehicle charging tends to happen residentially at the home, with the remaining 20% being split to kind of workplace type charging and en route charging. So when you're driving along a kind of like a petrol station type approach you would have now, where you stop off for 10 minutes to put some charge in. So I think that it goes all the way back, I think, to what's easy for the customer. And what's easy for the customer is you get home and you plug in. And then you just don't worry about it. And I've been driving an electric vehicle for nearly 12 years now, and I wouldn't go back to an internal combustion engine because I just think the experience is so much better from the EV.
Totally,
And
I agree. I've got one too.
Yeah, and it just becomes just part of your habit, right? It just you kind of come home and then this is what you do. And we're now a 2 electric vehicle household. I have one, my wife has one, and do you just take it in turns to use the charger different days? It just becomes part of what you do, and I think that customer ease is always an absolute key to any kind of decision making process.
To get this grid intelligence, I'm just going back a little bit here, Mark, to get that grid intelligence that obviously the networks need and the industry needs, it still is going to require more information from households, isn't it? And the concern, I suppose, is that we're going to end up with a 2-speed system. Are we risking creating a 2-speed energy system where we've got the tech-enabled households, they're going to benefit, but others are left more exposed to higher costs?
So that's a great question. It goes back to something I was talking about earlier, which we frame around the just transition, which is anything that you do as a network operator, or indeed anyone within the energy kind of value chain, you've got to ensure that you are not inconveniencing others. And of course, there are going to be some people who have the opportunity to maybe financially benefit more, right? If I can sell some of the excess capacity I've got in my electric vehicle battery via a vehicle to grid system and realize some economic value from that, Great, that's great for me. Is that benefiting the person down the street who doesn't have an electric vehicle? Well, you can argue they don't have the opportunity to play in that market. So is that fair? What I would say to that is that if by me selling that energy back into the system, I'm supporting the local system and I'm enabling that to operate in a really efficient way, which therefore means that network upgrades and infrastructure upgrades are not required. What I'm doing is I'm helping ensure that actually we can serve the needs of everyone without having to add to the bill by having expensive upgrades to the system to enable the energy transition to happen. So what should happen is everyone benefits because the system can be run more effectively and require less in terms of infrastructure upgrade, which would otherwise have to be footed by all customers in a kind of socialized way. So I think that's how you kind of say, look, everyone can benefit from this, whether it's directly the person who's playing into that marketplace or indirectly through not having that increase on bills due to network upgrades.
And in your view, do you think that the Australian networks have fully embraced that idea? Because the accusation for our networks here has been that they've gold-plated. They've built for the extreme situation, so their asset base has just increased phenomenally, really. Do you think this is almost like a changed business model for them, isn't it? Have they embraced that fully, that this will mean not creating or building extra infrastructure, which, they clearly will benefit from?
Yeah, so another great question, and I'm sure that my friends and colleagues in the network sector would argue that it wasn't gold plating; it was sound engineering principles. I think that I was talking to someone just yesterday from actually from New Zealand, who was talking about this, saying, "Look, we built the network, and we built the network based on information we had at the time around what we thought the requirements for each customer would be. So we sized the network to deliver, without getting too technical, they wanted to deliver kind of 5 kilowatt capacity per customer. And they've done some analysis to say, how much is each customer using right now? And the answer is about 2.5. So they're using half of the capacity. So there's plenty of capacity in that particular part of the network. Then as electric vehicles come along, that will increase that from 2.5 to 3.5. And if there's increasing, air conditioning load, say, or whatever that comes along, that might push it up towards kind of 4. So the good news is those sound engineering principles, I'll call them, that kind of the kind of
I'll call them
informed,
gold plating.
yeah, that informed some of those decisions are maybe bearing some fruit. But you're right in that, what it does mean going forward is that the flexibility and more efficient utilization and operation of networks should always be considered as the first choice. Network upgrade and infrastructure build should never be the go-to solution. And we've seen that again around the world. If you look at what the energy regulator in the UK, Ofgem, did through the last kind of 5 years, their mantra was flexibility first. So in order to kind of get approval for more network upgrade, you had to prove that you couldn't achieve the same outcomes via a flexible option. And I think we'll see that become more and more of, again, the norm as we look around the globe, and particularly into Australia.
Yeah. How does Australia compare, though, with the UK and what is happening in Europe?
I think it's broadly similar. The good news for Australia is the network kind of system is built on a very kind of almost Eurocentric type model, if I can call it such. It follows quite closely some of the regulations and the processes that are also in place there. And it means it shares an awful lot of common understanding, common language, and common approach with what's going on elsewhere. While some of those other countries have gone faster, particularly the UK, that has gone very fast in this space, it really gives the likes of Australia an opportunity to look at what's gone well in the UK and
Mm.
what's gone not quite so well, and just pick the good bits out of that and really learn from that and move on. And again, that's something, while I've been speaking very recently to a bunch of colleagues in Australia around things like electrification of transport and things like charge point operation. Should that be something that's within the purview of the network operator, or should it be in third-party commercial organizations and more market-led? And there's lots of great experiences from the UK and other countries that can really help inform that and ensure that some of the pitfalls that have been fallen into elsewhere don't happen here in Australia.
Now, we're running out of time, Mark, but just a couple more quick questions just about the report. It's no surprise that cost is the biggest concern for consumers. Beyond trying to lower bills, what actually works to help change consumer behaviour, or is it all about price?
I mean, there's no argument that price is the number one factor if you ask anyone. But the second most common factor is reliability. And reliability is going to become, as I said, increasingly important as we move into a world where we use electricity for the backbone of everything that we do. So again, I think by taking the approach to some of the things the report has outlined around having greater visibility of what's happening on networks, you can actually improve reliability as well as ensuring that operation is optimized to minimize cost. And one of the third drivers that we see coming through, the third most popular, again, it is different with different demographics, is around the decarbonisation agenda. There's a real feeling, certainly when I talk to colleagues in the UK, that networks want to be an enabler of net zero, not a barrier to it. So we've seen lots and lots of movement in Europe to things like accelerate the speed in which new low carbon technologies can be connected to network. Because if you can't connect enough EVs to the network, you're not going to hit your net zero targets. So accelerating those connections, making things work in a more efficient, quicker pace is also absolutely key to the future and to energy networks playing their part in the full achievement of the net zero goals.
Just a final question, Mark. Now, networks, as we know, are the ones that do have to take that long-term view on infrastructure. Just sum up for me, what does the long-term system look like if we get this right? And what happens if we don't, if we fail to unlock the capacity, the potential of our consumer energy resources?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as I opened with, really, if you were to cast your mind back kind of 40 years, people would have probably been horrified at the idea of all these multi-directional flows we've got on networks now. We've kind of come away from that unidirectional to that multi-directional system. What we're now moving towards and what the future for networks is a true energy system rather than just an energy network. And it's a true multi-stakeholder approach whereby it becomes different kind of contracts and relationships, if you like, that exist for customers in terms of how they engage with their networks and their energy systems. They're no longer just a consumer, they're a genuine customer who is engaging with services in a bilateral way where they're both selling and receiving those services moving forward. Networks have to be a true enabler of that and a true part of what that energy system future looks like. If they don't go down the route of having greater visibility and enabling that, what you're left with is instead of the smart system that we all need to achieve our goals, you're left with that dumb infrastructure where the only way you have of actually serving that is to more upgrades moving forward. And that involves higher cost, longer time, and a less valuable customer experience at the end of it.
Well, let's hope we don't go down that path. Mark Sprawson, thank you so much for joining the Switched On podcast today.
Thanks so much, Anne. It's been a pleasure.
And Mark Sprawson is the Chief Commercial Officer at EA Technology. It'll be interesting to see whether the Australian Energy Market Commission takes on any of Mark's suggestions when they bring down their final report on pricing and consumer energy resources in the very near future. I'm Anne Delaney. I hope you've enjoyed listening to Switched On. Don't forget to tell all your friends, colleagues, strangers in the street about us. They can find us on their favourite podcast platforms. I'll see you next time. Switched On Australia was proudly brought to you by GoodWe. GoodWe's all-in-one ESA home battery helps Australians store more of their own solar energy and rely less on the grid. With strong local support and technology already trusted in thousands of homes, GoodWe is making the switch to electrification simpler and more affordable. GoodWe is proud to work with Australian cricketer and GoodWe ambassador Alex Carey. Find out more at goodwe.com.au. Switched On Australia is also proudly brought to you by Boundless Earth. Boundless Earth uses philanthropy, investment and direct advocacy to help Australia become a global force in a decarbonised world.